D4 openings. Speaking in very general terms, one might say this is the more strategically oriented of White's two main opening moves. If on your classical opening move, the equally classical symmetrical reply is what you expect, then you know that after e4, e5, so e4, e5, you will immediately be able to attack an undefended pawn with knight to f3. Yep. Or the much more radical f4. Yep, King Gambit. White then has an obvious object of attack, which makes the situation relatively clear and straightforward. Okay, let's take a look at d4, d5 though. d4, d5. Things are very different because black's pawn on d5 is securely defended. Yet on closer inspection, it turns out that white is able to attack black's central stronghold, mainly because of the possibility of c4, the Queen's Gambit. This attack has a different feel and is slower than white's plans in the equivalent position after e4, e5. It is based on a long-term positional plan and therefore more of a strategic nature. That is why 1d4 did not really flourish until the rise of positional play in the late 19th century. Until then, 1e4 was by far the most popular move. This means that practically from the start, theory of the 1d4 openings have been developed by players whose general outlook on chess was similar to ours today. That is why almost all of these openings are still very much alive, which can hardly be said of the 1e4 complex. Especially in the 1e4, e5 section, quite a lot of the old theory has by now been shelved permanently. That's interesting. Yeah, so I guess e4 was an older opening than d4. And the old theory has now been shelved permanently. Interesting. Okay. Let's start. 1 to d4, the queen's pawn opening. All right, and I just want to compare the diagrams. If in the book, it also shows these same type of diagrams. D4. There's another diagram there. It's a little bit different based on the way the book looks. It's interesting. It has the diagrams out a little bit different. It actually adds additional diagrams. So we can see here, my tiny camera, let me go on the big screen here. So we can see here in the book, it brings up one of the D4 diagrams. But then we notice in the preview right after the D4, there's another diagram of the Queen's Gambit with 1 D5 and 2 C4. Interesting. So yeah, the Kindle is a little bit different than the book. Okay. Black's most classical reply has already been mentioned, D5. Until about 1920, this was by far the most highly regarded, and in some periods practically the only approved move. The crucial position arises if white then plays C4, which is the Queen's Gambit. Let's take a look at the opening explorer. So D4, and we see the top moves. There's Indian game, knight f6, queen's pawn opening, D5. Queen's pawn opening, the Horwitz defense, E6. Queen's pawn opening is also D6, okay. G6 is the modern defense against D4, okay. Got the Dutch defense, yep, F5. The old Benoni defense, C5. Queen's pawn opening, the McInnes defense, knight C6. Queen's pawn opening is also part of C6. English defense is B6, okay, interesting. Queen's pawn opening, the Polish defense, b5. The England Gambit, the England Gambit is e5. Interesting. Queen's pawn opening, the St. George defense, a6. You've heard that before. And the other, we got a Queen's pawn opening, Australian defense, knight a6. Anything else? And then the Queen's pawn opening, Borg defense, g5. Oh, that's funny. So we saw the Borg for e4, but we didn't see it against d4. But apparently, it has a name, and yeah, you could immediately win the pawn. Bishop takes g5. Wow. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to d5. And then it says the crucial position arises if white then plays c4 of the Queen's Gambit. Yep, so c4 is the top move. What else is there besides the Queen's Gambit? Well, we got Queen's pawn opening, the Zerka-Tort variation, which is knight f3, okay? Bishop f4, Queen's pawn opening, accelerated London system. Yep. Knight c3 is the Queen's pawn opening Chigorin variation. Bishop g5 is the Levesky attack. And then e3 doesn't really have a name. Oh, e4, the Queen's pawn opening Black-Mar Gambit, e4. Queen's pawn openings, all right. f4 is the Mason attack, okay. Queen to d3, the Amazon attack. It's funny, I got a buddy of mine, Boris. He's a Russian friend of mine. And we've been friends for lifelong friends, probably over 20 years. And he played this Queen's pawn opening Amazon attack in a tournament. And it was funny. I guess he wanted to change the open. I think he got a draw out of it at the end. But yeah, he played Queen d3, the Amazon attack. And the stats don't look too well. 33% for white, 11% draw, and 56% for black. What else? H4 is called the Kadas opening. Wow, okay. Anything else? G4 is the Zurich Gambit. Kind of almost like a Grob, but then bishop takes G4, yeah. And then king to D2, my goodness. All right, so if the crucial position arises if white then plays c4, the Queen's Gambit. Okay. Black's principal defenses to this setup have grown into three major independent openings. The Queen's Gambit declined with e6, which looks like the second most popular move, e6. The Slav Defense, which is actually the most popular, look at that, according to the Master Games chess.com database as of November 2024. So c6, the Slav Defense, and the Queen's Gambit accepted, d takes c4, which is the third most popular. Yep. These openings will be a subject of the first three chapters of this book. In the fourth, I shall give an overview of Black's less popular replies to c4 and of White's alternatives to c4. Yep, we saw a couple of openings there. Now, alternatives, most likely in the fourth chapter, will be these other popular moves. Knight c6, yeah, the Chigorin defense. e5, the Albin counter gambit. Bishop f5, the Baltic defense. The knight f6 is the Marshall defense, okay. c5, the Austrian variation. There's g6. What else is there? Okay. Queen's Gambit decline with g6. I wonder if that'll transpose to a Gruenfeld, maybe? Okay. Around 1920, the classical move d5 began to be seriously challenged by the rise of an alternative, knight to f6, yep, which is actually Indian game most popular move right now. Hesitant at first, suffering much scorn and sarcasm, Then quickly gathering momentum and eventually quite triumphantly, this move has risen to the top of the bill. Yeah. Let's see what's the most popular. Knight f6 is, 800,000 games, knight to f6. Over twice as many versus d5. Yep. It was only at 348,000. Traditional theory had maintained that knight to f6, although it does have the merit of controlling e4, yep, right there, and thus preventing 2e4, yep, had little more to offer against the logical c4 than a hasty retreat to the safe ground of the queen's gambit with e6 followed by d5, and therefore had little independent significance. Oh, interesting. Traditional theory maintained that knight f6, although it does have the merit of controlling e4, thus preventing e4. Yeah, is it actually preventing e4? Let's see. Do we ever see e4 in the moves? Yeah, it's called the Indian game Omega Gambit. Is e4 still. But it says, the theory says, hey, I'm just blocking, I'm just stopping e4. And what else? And a little offer against the logical c4. Then a hasty retreat to the safe ground of the queen's gambit with e6, followed by d5. So e6, yep, top move. And then let's say knight c3, and then d5. Yep, it transposed. Queen's gambit declined. Queen's knight variation. Okay. And so it said, therefore, it had little independent significance. In due course, it became clear, however, that black does not have just one, but several important possibilities. In fact, the position after d4, knight f6, c4, turned out a real goldmine of new openings. Most of these rose to prominence shortly after World War II, and knight f6 has been black's most popular defense to d4 ever since. Interesting. To begin with, it was discovered that black has e6, knight c3, bishop b4, the Nimzo-Indian defense. Then it turned out that black has two alternatives to 3d5 if white plays knight f3 instead of knight c3. Okay, let's see. Black has two alternatives to d5. Let's see, to d5. Oh, then it turned out black has two alternatives to d5. I see. So theory had said, hey, you know, like we said, knight c3, bishop, pawn to d5 for black, that's all you really have. You have to kind of go back to the queen's gambit, the safe grounds of the queen's gambit decline theory, which we all know about. But said, well, instead of d5, if white plays knight to f3, then we could do b6, which is called the Queen's Indian defense. And also we can do bishop b4, check, the Bogo Lajabao defense, or Bogo Indian. Wow, yep. I like the Bogo Indian name better. I don't know if I pronounced that right. The Bogo Lajabao defense, or Bogo Indian. All three have developed into very reliable openings, which are unlikely ever to disappear again. Even more spectacular was the gradual acceptance of 2g6. Yep. Instead of e6, g6, the King's Indian defense. Yep. No fewer than two new openings were introduced here, both equally important today and equally forceful. Okay. So after knight to c3, The move bishop g7 produces the king's Indian defense, yep, and more specifically the normal variation of the king's Indian defense, while d5 is the Gruenfeld defense. Finally, black also has the possibility of c5, which is called the Benoni. Oh, wait, sorry, 2c5. Well, okay, in the events, finally, yep, so at the end here, instead of e6 or g6, black can go c2, c5. Yep, that's the Benoni defense, called the Benoni. This opening contains a surprisingly large number of subvariations, all offering black an interesting game. Interesting. How many? d5, Benoni defense. Knight f3 is the English opening. Oh, it transposed. English opening, symmetrical, anti-Benoni variation. e3 is Benoni, d captures Benoni, and no other names there. Okay. All of these openings will get a chapter of their own. We shall then consider some minor alternatives on black's second move, and we shall see what happens if white refrains from playing c4. Apart from one d5 and one knight f6, black has several other replies, of which f5, the Dutch defense, is the most important, at least in a historical sense. In the 19th century, this opening was considered the only reasonable alternative to the classical 1d5. It was ranked far above knight f6 until that move became popular in 1920. The rise of the Indian openings pushed the Dutch defense into the background, but there it has held a respectable position ever since. Let's see, what f5, the Dutch defense is the sixth most popular, about 38,000 chose it. Out of the Dutch defense, 42% win for white, 29% draws, and 30% win for black. Okay. And after the Dutch defense, how many variations? We got g3, the fianchetto attack. c4 is Dutch. The Raphael variation, knight c3. Bishop g5 is the Hopton attack. e4 is the Staunton Gambit. Yep. Bishop f4. Oh, h3 is the Korchnoi attack. Okay, was it h3, g4 maybe? g4 is the Kretschik Gambit. Then the Alapin variation, queen to d3. That's interesting. That's similar to that Amazon attack, where d4, d5, queen d3. This is d4, f5, queen d3. Interesting. And then f4 is the bird's opening. It transposes. That's interesting. I guess do a symmetrical bird's opening, f4, f5, and then d4. Interesting. Okay. So, one d5 or one knight f6 and also one f5 are moves that prevent the opponent from taking up the ideal central pawn formation by playing e4, which is what white would undoubtedly do if black were to push his clock without making a move. And yet the term ideal central pawn formation is perhaps a misleading one. It is not only a matter of how white or black places his pawns in the center, it is equally important, and perhaps even more so, what he can do with those center pawns in any given situation. A broad pawn center can be strong, but it can also be vulnerable. It is strong if it cramps the enemy position or if it forms a base for an attack. It is vulnerable if it is being attacked, and it is weak when it crumbles as a result of that attack. It is a perfectly legitimate opening strategy for black to let white build up a central pawn formation to his liking. If he does so without a plan and the necessary determination to fight back at the first opportunity, however, opening theory will regard this as a betrayal of its principles and turn its back on the offender. But if he acts with a plan and with determination, the result may be a fascinating opening struggle, In that case, black allows his opponents to form a broad pawn center, only with the firm intention to annihilate it. So the major representatives of this category of openings are, we've got e6, which was called the Horowitz defense. We've got d6, is still called queen's pawn opening, and g6, the modern defense with 1d4. A respectable body of theory has been developed around all three of these moves, especially in the last 3 decades. But to put this into perspective, for after all, this is still only a fraction of the theory attached to the big 1d4 openings, I have condensed this into a single chapter. All right, very interesting.